Hello, everyone. So my talk today, along with everyone else's here, is about the future. It's the thread that connects all the topics this evening together. But something which you may not have paid much attention to is that all of these talks are also linked by the fact they're being delivered through language. And yes, it sounds kind of obvious because I'm giving a speech. I need some way to communicate with my audience, but it's true. Language is integral to our society. We use it almost constantly. And as a result, changes in our society are often reflected in changes in our speech. And one linguistic development, which has been very talked about over the past few years, is gender-neutral language. But what is gender in language anyways? Well, in more gendered languages, such as Spanish, it can be seen in the way that nouns and adjectives have to agree with each other in terms of gender. So in the phrase, la niña alta, all three of these words end in an A, which in Spanish typically denotes a feminine word. Now, in English, we don't really have this gendered agreement of nouns and adjectives, but you can still see gender in the singular pronouns he and she. So, back to gender-neutral language. Well, that's any language that avoids bias towards a particular sex or gender, and the English equivalent of this can be seen in singular they. Now, the singular form of they isn't a new concept. Far from it. The Oxford English Dictionary traces the first recorded use of singular they all the way back to 1375. And since spoken forms often appear in speech long before they're written down, it's very likely that this form appeared even earlier. And throughout history, it's been used by prolific writers, such as Chaucer, Shakespeare, and Austen. Furthermore, you is used as both a singular and a plural pronoun. No one complains about it being ambiguous or confusing, two common arguments against the use of singular they. And singular you only really became common in the 1600s, more than 200 years after the earliest recorded use of singular they. Now, Spanish doesn't have such a pronoun, and many of its words don't really have gender-neutral alternatives. So instead, there are suggestions on how to implement this. And one such change would be to replace the O and A with an E whenever a gender-neutral form needed to be used. This could also come with the addition of two new pronouns, ella for singular they, and ellas for plural they. Now, the Royal Spanish Academy, whose job it is to ensure the stability of the language, haven't accepted any of these proposed changes, not just the possibility of an E form. But instead, they have said that the masculine plural is inclusive and includes non-men. Now, this is true grammatically, but it doesn't really address the reality, which is that Spanish is a very gendered language, and by refusing to accept the possibility of gender-neutral forms, they're leading to the further exclusion of people who don't identify within the gender binary, as well as reinforcing the male view that the language has. We're very lucky in English to have something like singular they that's already in common use, because a lot of languages don't have that option. And for the most part, it's very hard to convince people to speak in a way that they think feels unnatural or new to them, especially if neologisms are involved. But could it be done? Well, Swedish, much like English and Spanish, has a he pronoun, hon, han, and a she pronoun, a he pronoun, han, and a she pronoun, hon. But it doesn't have a gender-neutral form. But a term which was believed to have been created in the 60s arrived, hen. Now, it only really reached the public in 2012 when a children's book was published that only used this new pronoun to refer to its characters. But was it really an effective implementation, or did it just get cast aside? Well, in 2011, 1 year before the release of this book, there were 13,000 uses of han and hon to match one use of hen. But in 2018, this had dropped to 133 to 1. What makes this even more impressive is that new pronouns are added into languages very rarely. Now, of course, the implementation of the pronoun isn't perfect. It's more likely to be used by younger generations and in urban areas. But it proves a very important point, that people can and do change their language when it is useful for them. And having a pronoun like singular they is useful because you can use it in so many situations. You've all likely used it today multiple times and haven't even noticed. You can use it to refer to someone when you don't know their gender, or when the person you're talking about doesn't identify as male or female. But what's the point? I'm sure there are some of you sitting here thinking, why should I go to this effort to change my language? What are the benefits? Well, an experiment also conducted in Sweden in 2019 did a survey to find out what the effects of gender-neutral pronouns were on speakers' views towards gender equality and tolerance towards the LGBTQ+ community. They theorized that due to the prevalence of patriarchal attitudes, masculine pronouns would continue to put the emphasis on men and lead to a bias which would shape speakers' views in a male-centered direction. And this would also make them more likely to endorse traditional gender roles, as these are rooted in a patriarchal worldview, and would increase the chances that anti-LGBTQ prejudice would occur, as this is based in perceived gender role violations. However, they found the opposite to be true when gender-neutral pronouns were used. So, just through the addition of these very small words, there is a quantifiable mental shift of people's attitudes towards equality and tolerance. And personally, I think that that's something that's well worth the effort. So, can we make all of our language completely gender neutral? No. Well, not really. As I just said, there have been successful implementations of gender neutral language into languages like Swedish, and languages like Spanish are very likely to see an increase in the amount of gender neutral language used in the coming years. But a language like Swedish has around 10 million speakers, all concentrated in Sweden and some parts of Finland. A language like Spanish has over 500 million, scattered across the globe in more than 20 countries. Now, this poses a problem. It's much easier to implement language change when it's spoken by a select group and in a select place. So, while making a language like Swedish completely gender neutral might be feasible, one like Spanish definitely isn't. And honestly, it would be a waste of resources. Complete gender neutrality in our language isn't necessarily what we should be aiming for. Rather, we should be aiming for inclusive language where we have the option to speak gender neutrally. Because when we have that option, we can make our society a safer and more inclusive place. Ultimately, language is a tool, one that will change to adapt to its speaker's needs, because that's why language changes, utility. It's the reason why we have words like texting, which definitely didn't exist in Shakespeare's time, because they didn't need to use them. We, however, do. Language change isn't something being forced in by the youth. It's a natural and integral part of all languages. All of them. Now, small conscious changes can help to make our society a more inclusive place to live in. And while making our language more inclusive isn't going to solve sexism, transphobia, homophobia, and all of the countless other issues that are linked to social gender, it can certainly help to create a space where we can talk about these issues and help resolve them, and hopefully put us on a path towards a future where these issues no longer exist. A future I really hope is one we can live in. Thank you.